projecting.
Yeah.
Right.
Laura,
Yeah.
when you ask the question, you point the mic back at your mouth. Okay?
Right.
It's one of those mics. Would you like some water?
Just wait till the car goes by. Okay. Barbara, you just spent 5 days at the Interlaken Junior High School, which was a makeshift jail. Could you tell me how you got there and what your experience there meant to you?
Right. Well, I got there by sitting down at the bridge in Interlaken when a group of, I think it was about 200 townspeople, though they'd promised the sheriff that they were not going to blockade our walk, a walk in celebration of some of the great women of the last wave of feminism, some of them from around this part of the country who had in fact made their part of the country famous. So you might say that it was ironic in a way that they wanted to stop this walk, which was celebrating part of their history, really. But I would say that in spite of the fact that you might say, why are you stopping us from honoring your history, that their perception of us was really very accurate. And those who, a few women, I'm afraid, have felt dismay when we sat down at that bridge and didn't, when the sheriff wanted us just to go away. He wanted us to do just what the townspeople did. They were shouting at us, go away, go away. And that's what he tried to tell us too, though he'd originally given us permission to walk. But I seem to be losing the thread of my sentence. But
Why did the women decide not to go away, even though the townspeople were yelling, go home and go away?
I could give several answers to that. In the first place, of course, our most basic constitutional rights were being flouted. We had an absolute right, which the sheriff had admitted, to walk through that town. Simple freedom of speech. One reason that I sat down and didn't go away, there were also, I think, safety reasons. The crowd really was threatening, and we all felt it was, we sat down first, I think, we sat down for two reasons. We sat down to say we have a right to do this. We also sat down to diffuse their violence, because though we were saying we have a right to do this, we were also saying we're not going to thrust our way through you. And when it came to, and I think if we had turned and retreated, we would have been in more danger. But to go back to how the crowd perceived us, I think they perceived us very accurately as a threat to patriarchal power. And one thing that makes me feel that our action there on the bridge is very deeply connected with our actions at the depot and very deeply connected to our reason for being here as women only, an encampment of women. Because actually, if we were just there at the depot saying nuclear weapons are a threat to us all, there's no reason why we shouldn't be men and women. Many men feel that too. I think what distinguishes us here is that we have, almost all of us, the feminist vision that we're never going to end war unless we dissolve the patriarchy. And I think the crowd at the bridge recognized, not consciously but unconsciously, that that's precisely what we're saying. Blue London, before she left, I heard her say to one person interviewing her that the things that they were screaming at us were very significant. She made, I thought, a beautiful analysis of it. They were saying, go home, commies, go home, Jews, nuke the lesbies. Sometimes they also said, kill the Jews, and let's see some blood. And she said, when they said, go home, commies, most of them don't really know what communism is, but they saw another form of government. When they said, go home, Jews, they saw another form of religion. When they said, nuke the lesbies, they saw another form of sexuality. And it's true, if you dissolve patriarchy, you change the form of government, the form of religion, the form of sexuality. So in a certain sense, they were very perceptive, even though they were out of their minds.
Do you think the villagers then had good reason to feel threatened? Do you think that they will lose if women do become more powerful, and if lesbians and Jews become more powerful? Do you think people who are men and Christians and heterosexuals will lose something?
No, what I was trying to say in my statement at court was they were fearing us, and that's why both the villagers were full of fear of us, and that's why they were threatening us, and those who arrested us were full of fear of us, and that's why they arrested us. But I said, they have really no need to fear us. It's true that we want to change everything utterly, so they will lose what they now think they need, which is control, power, ownership of women's bodies, ownership of the land. The lie of ownership has them intoxicated. But one thing that was thrilling to me about both what happened on the bridge and what happened in the jail was that the process we set in motion to protect ourselves and to guide us in how we should behave was a process which is the opposite of what they now have, the opposite of hierarchy, the opposite of ownership. And what thrilled me was that as they observed it, I could see them begin to respect it and begin to not feel threatened by it. And this is our message to them. Our message is we're going to utterly change the process of our lives. And don't be scared of it. It's going to take from you what you think you need, but you don't need it. So even at the bridge there, I think the fact that they saw us sit down, what we did, I thought, worked so well. Some of us sat down in a circle, and some of us continued to face them and to talk with them. And in the circle, they could see us, even in this dangerous and kind of situation in which the police kept trying to rush us and make us feel we had to decide instantly. We insisted on not making any decision until each woman had a voice. And I was surprised right then at how the police consented to wait. They, in spite of themselves, respected this process and they could have said, tell me right now, or we're going to do it right now. And in a certain sense, they started out saying that, but as soon as we ignored that ultimatum and just insisted on this process, they respected it. The same, another instance that to me was so dramatic. When the authorities at the jail discovered that 2 women had escaped out the window, they panicked because their authority had been flouted, and they had to reassert their authority and their power. And though the women guards who'd been guarding us, we'd begun to establish real friendships, and they had begun to respect us again, watching our process. Even they, when the men entered the scene, and he wasn't the sheriff, I forget his exact denomination, and they, of course, could feel their jobs at risk, and you could understand why they were panicking, but their faces changed. This rigidity entered, and we were ordered out to the halls, even though we were half-dressed. It was very cold out there, and they were being very strict and very ungentle with us, and we were out there in the halls while they searched the rooms. This was so wild, because first they did a count, then they did a count again, they did a count again. We obviously 2 were missing. Then they began to look under the beds, and they looked under the beds again. Then they began to look in corners where women couldn't possibly be hidden. For a while it was comic, except we all knew it's going to turn from comedy to something very unfunny very soon. So we waited for that, and as soon as we were out into the hall, we knew that another scene had begun, and the voices became very harsh, and for a while we lost it and began to yell a little back and forth, yelled that it was cold and could we have blankets? No, we couldn't, and why not? And then something happened that was very scary, and it was especially scary for the Jewish women among us because it just reverberated so. The concentration camps. I think it also reverberated in any woman there, sort of the witch persecutions, because it became so irrational. At a certain point, they'd already searched the rooms. Now we were to be taken back into the rooms one by one, and our bodies were to be searched, and the women put on rubber gloves. As soon as I saw the women put on rubber gloves, a kind of sense of terror invaded me because I thought what they were doing, whether they recognized it or not, they were going to look for those women in our bodies. So it took you right back to the witch persecution mentality, you know. And of course it took the Jewish women in our midst right back into the concentration camps. But what happened here too is when we began to calm down and follow our process of asking them reasonable questions, among them the question, do you think you can find these missing women in our vaginas? You know? And we began to say, why are you punishing us for what two people who were not present have done? And we began to ask all kinds of pertinent questions and not yell them at them, but take our familiar turn in asking them and wait for their reply and turn the thing into one of these meetings where each person is allowed to speak. They began to calm down, and by the end of it, because we reestablished that process, and even though too they'd been on the point of, they dragged one woman already, and the mood was just for rush, force this on us. But they began to both respect and I think be grateful for our process, which enabled them to come out of this mood of just cuckoo-ness. And at the end of it, the man, who was some kind of sub-sheriff, I guess, I don't know what his title was, he ended by, he had to assert, well, this is the last kind act I'm going to perform, but we were allowed to walk back into the room without any search. When he had said, this is the last kind act, he started out by saying, we've been very kind to you, you know, we have given you good food. And that's one of the points where the women began to say, but you say you've been kind, but we shouldn't be here at all, you know, to make these points. But as I say, what was so thrilling to me was to discover, and what gave me such hope for the future is to see that they too were grateful when we established another process. And I would say this process is what the end of patriarchy is. And I would like to find more and more ways of saying to them, look, don't be scared of us, because what has just happened and what you were grateful that happened is all that we're trying to bring into being.
The scenario you just described in prison sounds really incredible, and that the process not only transformed yourselves in some way, but also your imprisoners. But I have a question about hierarchy and consensus, or lack of hierarchy and consensus, that is the norm here, but is not the norm out in society. And it seems like in a society this size, perhaps it can work with consensus and without hierarchy. Can that work in a larger community, in a city, in New York City, in the United States? Do you think it can work, and how?
I have no doubt that it can work, but when you say how, I think it has continually to be invented. We had to continually invented inside that room. For instance, there was a time, and there was times when we'd lose it, and then we'd discuss how we'd lost it and how there was something we had to invent. For instance, when we learned that the two women had escaped, let's see, there was one time when most of the discussions we had were completely open discussions, and we were glad that our guards, who were the women guards, were listening, because we felt they too were learning from it, and they too were learning what we were like. And it was interesting that in the beginning they would interrupt our meetings with yells of who was to go for a shower or something. But after we asked them, not to interrupt it with the yells, they began to come, and they'd stand there for a moment and wait for a moment, even if they had some news they had to give us, wait for a moment that wasn't such an interruption, say, "Excuse me, but..." But there were times when it couldn't be open because it might put someone in jeopardy if it were open, so we had to try to invent a way in which you'd form smaller circles, and then someone from the smaller circle would ask someone else to form another circle and discuss it. So, I think you could well say, though, a lot of people would have said that we couldn't afford that process in our situation. We had, 53 women, often decisions that had to be made. You would think very quickly, and you would say, and it would have been quicker if you'd delegated a few women whom we trust to make these decisions. It would have been infinitely quicker, and it wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have represented us. And I think the same is true in the larger society. It will always look. Some people will always say you can't afford to give everyone a voice, and there isn't time. But I would say all the time spent in doing it faster is wasted time, because the decisions you come out with aren't the right decisions. But it has to be invented, Just as, for instance, sometimes we just go around the circle taking turns. Sometimes we'd have what was called a floating chair. One woman would speak, then people would raise hands, and the woman who'd just spoken would call on one of the raised hands. Or sometimes, if there was pressure of time, a lawyer, for instance, would only be there for 10 minutes and had to have an answer. You'd choose a facilitator who had some experience and who'd tried to keep the thing to the issue in a especially concentrated way. And there you would use people who'd had a little more experience. Oh, there was one fascinating moment when the court hearing was coming up, and there were going to be, if we won the right to be seen as a group, the judge couldn't hear each one of us, so we were going to have representatives. And the question is how to choose them. And it started out with a few women nominating certain people who they thought were especially articulate. And this process had gone. A few women had been suggested, and someone objected and said, "This isn't the way we've been doing things. At this point, we trust any woman in this group to speak for us, and this is getting hierarchical again." And we went around the circle to see how people felt about this. Most people were willing to trust any woman, especially since some of the women already had said that they wouldn't trust themselves. So we decided on drawing lots just out of a hat. And if any woman would feel that she didn't want to do this, she could withdraw her name. This to me was really putting it to the test, because... And the strange thing that happened was that when we did draw numbers from the hat, and some of the numbers were of women who said they were sorry, they might just faint, or they would rather not, so another number would be called. The mysterious thing was that at least two of the numbers that finally came up were two of the women whom had first been called upon to represent us. But again and again we'd be tempted to do it the old way, but then finally insist on doing it this every woman has a voice way. And the more we thought about it, the more everybody would become happy with that way.
Can you think of any examples of how decisions have been made at the encampment where the consensus process has been subverted and the solutions have not been successfully reached?
I'm not the one to speak to that because I think it was the day after I arrived here, I sat down at the bridge, and though I've heard some stories about how there hasn't been this process, I don't think it makes sense just to speak at second hand.
But you do feel, it sounds like you feel very positive about what the process that happened in prison and also prior to going to jail. And do you feel that that kind of process will continue here, and are you going to be part of it?
I'm not sure how much longer I'll stay, partly because I'm not sure how much longer my body can go without going back home and deeply resting. I'm tempted just to stay on and on and on. Also, I want to go home and try and write, and I'll have to gauge, how much I'll forget of the experience in jail if I don't go home and start taking notes soon.
Okay, well, we're running out of tape, but thank you very much. It's much appreciated.